next slide. So today's topic is network code on cybersecurity that you know is already ongoing public consultation on the risk assessment methodologies. So the network code itself came into force a while ago, which had various deliverables for ENTSO-E and DSO entity. One of them is risk assessment methodologies that today our speakers will introduce you to. Our speakers for today are Julien Keller, who is the subgroup lead of this deliverable, together with Bart Luyks, who's also our subgroup lead and a co-lead in this activity, and Martin Huwe, who's our cybersecurity expert. Please note that all the deliverables are drafted commonly between ENTSO-E and DSO entity, hence also our speakers are representing both of the associations and common work done. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor for the first topic. So I think we can move to the next slide to Julien, if I'm not mistaken. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daiga. Hello, everybody. So as Daiga said, I will present the general background. To be sure, yes, I think you can hear me. Okay, so can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first question is, why do we need a network code on cybersecurity? Firstly, security of electricity supply has an outstanding importance for all European citizens, societies, and industrial sectors. The ongoing transition of the electricity sector towards decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization requires additional measures to safeguard security of electricity supply in the years to come. Secondly, the intercontinental European electricity grid has a unique characteristic. As through cascading effects in case of a cyber attack, each EU member state could be affected by the weakest actor. Finally, the digitalization of legacy systems used in the electricity sector is creating new risks and new vulnerabilities in an increasingly complex environment. It is therefore clear that prevention and management of electricity crises related to cyber attacks require a common framework of rules and coordinated procedure allowing EU member states and other actors of the electricity sector to coordinate their cybersecurity effort and solidarity across borders. So in this context, the EU adopted the NCCS, which is part of a wider EU effort to promote digitalized, green, and resilient energy system. Thank you for the next slide. So then the question is, what is the NCCS regulatory background? The NCCS is a European regulation adopted as a delegated act by the European Commission, which is directly applicable and legally binding in all EU member states. It complements other European cyber legislation regarding the electricity sector, for example, the NIS2 directive, whenever cross-border electricity flows are concerned. Can you move to the next slide, please? Here, we are now going to ask ourselves which entities are in the scope of the NCCS. So the NCCS obligations applies to entities defined as high impact or critical impact entities, the classification of which depends on how severely a potential cyber attack affecting the entity's processes and related assets could compromise cross-border electricity flows. To assess this impact, the NCCS provides the basis for specific methodologies with threshold and parameters in order to identify the processes, supporting assets, and operating entities that could possibly affect cross-border electricity flows. Potential actors from the electricity sector that might, in principle, qualify as high impact or critical impact entity are listed, as you can see in Article 2, like producers, suppliers, NEMOs, aggregators, etc. The entities involved in the delivery of those processes will then be obliged to implement the obligations set out in the NCCS. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So now we talk about the governance aspects. So the implementation and execution of the NCCS involves various authorities and institutions at national and European level. Each EU member state must designate a national authority in charge of the NCCS. This authority is called the NCA, for National Competent Authority for the NCCS. The respective national regulatory authority for energy acts as NCA by default and may delegate powers to other national authorities. All 27 NCAs will jointly approve the terms, conditions, and methodology foreseen under the NCCS, such as the high impact and critical impact processes. So, at regional level, the regional coordination centers will be involved in the NCCS tasks. And at European level, ENTSO-E and DSO entity are responsible for proposing terms, conditions, and methodology foreseen in the NCCS, as well as prepare reports and cybersecurity exhaustive scenarios. ACER, supported by ENISA, monitors the proposal approved by all NCAs together. We can now move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yes. So now let's see which cybersecurity aspects are covered by the NCCS. So the NCCS main objective is to guarantee the security and resilience of cross-border electricity flows, while also fostering collaboration on cybersecurity matters in the electricity sectors among EU member states. To achieve this, the NCCS addresses several key areas including, so first, we have the performance of cyber risk assessments, then the definition and implementation of minimum and advanced security controls. We also have the development of supply chain security recommendations. And finally, the sharing of information in case of cyber attacks, vulnerabilities, or threats. Next slide, please. So here we have a 10-year chronological overview. So the NCCS will introduce robust cybersecurity measures and effective methodologies to mitigate the risk related to cross-border electricity flows. So here, these are the main milestones of the NCCS implementation process. First, before the end of 2024, the NCCS should be designated in each EU member state. And at the beginning of the next year, 2025, the provisional ECII and threshold should let them designate the first high impact and critical impact entities. These entities can, on voluntary basis, start applying the NCCS. Then in 2028, high impact and critical impact entities will be officially notified according to the result of the first Union-wide risk assessment. These entities will have to perform during the first year a risk assessment that NCCS will use as input to consolidate the national risk assessment. In 2027, minimum and advanced cybersecurity controls will be defined and approved by NCAs, and high impact and critical impact entities will have to implement them in 2028 through a cybersecurity management system that will have to be verified for critical impact entities in 2030. Cybersecurity exercises will be organized at entity or national level in 2028 and at regional or cross-regional level in 2029 and every 3 years thereafter. So that was the general overview of the background. So now I will give the floor to Bart to present risk assessment processes.
Yes, so I will give you an overview of the risk assessment process. Can everyone understand me?
Yep, we hear you well.
Okay, thank you. Well, next slide, please. Well, this slide gives you an overview of the whole cybersecurity risk assessment cycle. So we have different layers. So on top of it, you see in sort of dark purple, you see the union level. In gray, more or less in the middle, and on the right side, you see the regional level. And below, you see the entity level, and that's green. between the gray regional level and, between the green level below and the gray regional level, you see also the member state level, which is in dark blue. So this is an overview of all the risk assessment processes that are defined in the network code and the outcomes of each process. The assessment for each level, so union level, regional level, member state level, and entity level, includes evaluate the possible consequences of a cyber attack affecting the operational security of the electricity system and disrupting cross-border electricity flows. And it's not considering the legal, financial, or reputational damages of cyber attacks. So that's the risk assessment methodology. You see also in pink aligned in the whole process, which is the risk assessment methodology that we all use on the different levels. So next slide, please. Well, on this slide, as you see an overview of the methodologies, which was on the previous slides in pink. So the cybersecurity risk assessment methodology shall include a list of the cyber threats to be considered. It considers the criteria to evaluate the impact of the cybersecurity risk as high or critical using defined thresholds for consequences and likelihood. An approach to analyze the cybersecurity risk coming from legacy systems, the cascading effects of cyber attacks, and the real-time nature of systems operating the grid. It also considers an approach to analyze the cybersecurity risk coming from the dependencies on a single supplier of ICT products, ICT services, or ICT processes. So also our service providers are in scope. Well, this cybersecurity risk assessment methodologies shall assess the cybersecurity risks using the same risk impact matrix. This matrix shall measure the consequences of cyber attacks and the likelihood of an incident. The next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Well, the first cybersecurity risk assessment to perform is at the union level. So it starts above in the previous slide that we saw, and also to draw up a draft union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment report. It corresponds to Article 19 of the Network Code on Cybersecurity. This action has to be done within 9 months after the approval of the risk assessment methodologies and is every 3 years thereafter. So there is a cycle of 3 years. The goal is to identify, analyze, and to evaluate the possible consequences of cyber attacks affecting the operational security of the electricity system and disrupting cross-border electricity flows. The union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment considers of 4 steps. The first step is that identify processes at electricity sector level that could affect the operational security of the electricity system. Then the second step is determine the possible consequences of a cyber attack compromising the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information used in them. The third step is identify the union-wide high impact and critical impact processes. And at last, the fourth step, define the electricity cybersecurity impact indices and high impact and critical impact thresholds. Well, this union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment results are formalized in a report that contains the following information. First, the union-wide high-impact processes and the union-wide critical impact processes. It contains a risk impact matrix. It contains an assessment of the possible consequences of a cyber attack. And at last, the ECIIs and the high-impact and critical impact thresholds. Then the next slide. Well, each competent authority shall identify, by using the ECCI and the high impact and critical impact thresholds included in the union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment report, the previous slide, the high impact and critical impact entities in its member states that are involved in the union-wide high impact and critical impact process. Each competent authority shall, within 9 months, after being notified by ENTSO-E, an EU TSO entity, of the union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment report, and in any case, no later than 48 months after entry into the force, notify to the entities on the list that they have been identified as high impact or critical impact entity. Next slide, please. Well, once again, you see here the entity cybersecurity risk assessment. So the timeline is every 3 years, you're notified that you're in scope. And then responsible are the entities that are critical impact entities and high impact entities. Next slide, please. Well, then it comes to the member state cybersecurity risk assessment, which is in Article 20. Well, within 21 months after the notification of high and critical impact entities, and every 3 years after that date, and after consulting the CS and CA responsible for electricity, each competent authority, supported by the CSIRT, shall provide a member state cybersecurity risk assessment report to ENTSO-E for electricity and the EU DSO entity. The goal of the member state cybersecurity risk assessment is to identify and analyze the risks of cyber attacks affecting the operational security of the electricity system and disrupting cross-border electricity flows in one member state. The cybersecurity risk assessment at member state level consists of 4 steps. The first step is determine the implementation status of the minimum and advanced cybersecurity controls. Secondly, aggregate the risk analysis results from the risk assessment at entity level to determine the consequences and likelihood of a compromise of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information used in them. Then the third step, summarize the information on cyber attacks and threats gathered pursuant Article 38 and sub 6 of the network code, and at last, the fourth step, recommend additional cybersecurity controls to mitigate high and critical impact risks to the ENTSO-E and DSO entity. Then the member state's cybersecurity risk assessment results are formalized in the member state cybersecurity risk assessment report. The information needed to perform the member state level risk assessment is derived from the entity level cybersecurity risk assessment. In particular, all high impact and critical impact entities will report to their competent authority the identified risk according to the same risk impact matrix defined during the union-wide risk assessment. The competent authority will aggregate the risks derived from the entity level cybersecurity risk assessment to assess the overall risks in the member state. Then next slide, please. Well, after the member state level, we have now the regional cybersecurity risk assessment. Well, within this region, the regional cybersecurity risk assessment is the last step in the risk assessment cycle. Within 30 months after the notification of the high and critical impact entities, and every 3 years after that, ENTSO-E and EU DSO entity, and in consultation with the NIST Cooperation Group, shall draw up a regional cybersecurity risk assessment report for each system operation region. While the union-wide risk assessment only considers consequences, the goal of the regional risk assessment is to identify, analyze, and evaluate the risk of cyber attacks affecting the operational security of the electricity system and disrupting cross-border electricity flows. The regional risk assessment is the basis for several other documents. First, the regional risk mitigation plan, that's Article 22 in the network code. Then secondly, the comprehensive cross-border electricity cybersecurity risk assessment report, which is Article 23 of the network code. Then third, updates of the minimum and advanced cybersecurity controls, which is Article 29 in the code. And that includes the controls in the supply chain, which is Article 33. Then at last, the fourth step, cybersecurity procurement recommendations. Well, that is all contains this report. Well, then the regional cybersecurity risk assessment consists of 5 steps. First, aggregate the risk analysis derived from the member state risk cybersecurity assessments to determine the consequences and likelihood of a compromise of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information used in them. Secondly, evaluate these risks analyzed in the previous step. Then the third step, determine the cybersecurity threats that lead to high and critical risks. Then the fourth step, determine minimum and advanced cybersecurity controls to mitigate the identified risks. Then the fifth step, the last, determine the applicability of the minimum and advanced cybersecurity control to system operations regions. Then the next slide, please. Well, then we are heading towards the Regional Cybersecurity Risk Mitigation Plan. Well, ENTSO-E shall submit the Regional Risk Mitigation Plan to the relevant transmission system operators, the TSOs, to the competent authorities, and to the Electricity Coordination Group, who may recommend amendments. The TSOs, with the assistance of ENTSO-E and EODSO entity, and in consultation with the NIST Cooperation Group, shall update the Regional Risk Mitigation Plans every 3 years. Then the next slide, please. Well, then we have here the report of the comprehensive cross-border electricity cybersecurity assessment report. And then finally, we had for the next slide, which contains the next steps. I think, Dijka, you step in.
Yes, before that, we have the explanation of the risk assessment methodologies themselves by Martin. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So what I will do is sort of now give you a guided tour of the risk methodologies itself. I hope you can see them on the screen now. So I would like to show you what's in the document, why we've made certain choices, and also highlight some of the points where we would like to have your specific input, because as you may have seen, there are some specific questions attached to the public consultation. So we're especially asking input on some specific questions that I will mention also. So I'll start with the front page. As I said, we were talking about cybersecurity risk assessment methodology, but the full title is actually below it. There's a few things I would like to highlight there. First, this is a proposal made of all TSOs. So the final methodology has to be approved by the competent authorities. The network code provides a process for doing this, and it's going through the all TSO process. So this is why it's a proposal of all TSOs. Once it has been approved by the competent authorities, the methodologies will be sort of a formal legal document, and it will be binding to all the parties involved in network code. So this is not just a technical document. This is actually something that's legally binding, and once it's been approved, we have to follow this methodology to perform the risk assessments. Second, as Dijka already said, this is a document that's been fully developed together between ENTSO-E and the EODSO entity. So I've been working with both TSO and DSO experts to develop this methodology in a subgroup for the network code working group. And the third thing is the scope. So there are 3 levels in scope here. It's the union level, region level, and member state level. What's particularly not in scope is the entity level risk assessment. So network code also includes a risk assessment for each entity. But these are not covered by this methodology. All the requirements for the entity level risk assessments are already included in network code legal text. So in principle, entities can choose their own method for the entity level risk assessment, but there are specific requirements that are already included in network code itself. And finally, this has been developed according to Article 18 of the network code itself. We think we are meeting all the requirements that are in this article. And if you want to see how we're doing this, the supporting document actually contains a table where we map all the requirements in Article 18 to the specific section in the methodology to show that we're covering everything that is required by the network code. So going down from the title to the table of contents, just to show what's in the document. So there's some general provisions just to introduce it and some definitions, but then the real meat of the document are the next 3 titles. There's one title on unified risk assessment, one on the regional risk assessment, and one on the member state risk assessment. So we have sort of titles describing each of the steps in the risk assessment process. Then finally some final provisions, and at the end of the document we have certain annexes with sort of the technical details such as the impact metrics and thresholds, the threats to be considered, and some reporting templates to make it easier to report the results of the risk assessments. So I'll start immediately with the Title 1, Title 2, the unified risk assessment. So to go back to Bart's presentation, for the unified risk assessment, we're all the way at the top left, where the start of the risk assessment cycle. We're looking at risk from a unified perspective, so for the whole EU. And the goal of the unified risk assessment is essentially to determine the scope of the network code for cybersecurity. And that's done in two ways. One output will be the ECI and thresholds. So ECI is European Cybersecurity Impact Indices. These are sort of metrics that measure how much impact an entity can have on the European electricity system. And then there's thresholds for when entities high or critical impact. And these are then given to the competent authorities to identify which entities are higher critical impact and will be covered by the requirements of the network code. The second outcome is a list of union-wide high-impact processes and critical impact processes. So these are the processes that come out of union-wide risk assessment. In a way, the union-wide risk assessment is sort of a business impact assessment, but then at EU level. So we're looking at the sector-wide processes in the electricity sector and determining if a compromise of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of such a process can actually have a higher critical impact on the electricity system. And the outcome will be this list of union-wide high critical impact processes. This is actually then given to the entities, and this is sort of the starting point for their scope. So the entities need to do their entity-level risk assessment, and they have to cover all their internal business processes that match these high and critical impact processes considered here. So these will be the main two outputs. For the ECI, you can already get an impression. A provisional ECI have already been published on the ENTSO-E and DSO entity websites. These give an impression of what the ECI will be, but they're not yet binding. This is just a first attempt, and they will be updated in unified risk assessment. And in December, we will also publish a provisional list of unified high critical impact processes to give you some idea of what these will look like after the unified risk assessment. So going back to the document itself. So you see the objective. The one thing I want to stress here is that the union-wide risk assessment only considers consequences, so it does not consider the likelihood component of risk. In that sense, it's like a business impact assessment. Then the second paragraph gives the steps that would be done during union-wide risk assessment. So we start with sort of a long list. We identify possible processes that could affect the operational security of the electricity system. Then for each process, we analyze the possible consequences by applying the impact metrics that are given in the annex. And then we apply the thresholds in the last step in the annex to determine which is high critical impact. And finally, we develop the ECI that are then used to identify the high critical impact entities. And for each of these steps here, there's an article in the methodology further explaining it. So for the identification, this is just, we provide sort of a long list of possible processes. You will see an example of how this will be done in the provisional process list, but basically this is a first sort of long list of possible processes that could impact the electricity sector. Then we take in Article 5, we take this long list of possible processes and we do sort of a type of business impact assessment. So we analyze the possible consequences of a compromise of confidentiality, integrity, or availability through a cyber attack. And there we will apply the impact metrics that we'll come to later in Annex 1. There are some sort of general guidelines on how we, criteria for how we would determine the impact given here. So we look at intentional impacts. We also look at indirect consequences, specifically also looking at cascading effects if there is an impact, which is one of the requirements for network code. We are considering controls that limit the impact. So if there's a backup process or sort of reverting to manual workaround, then we take that into account when determining consequences. And we will try to take into account also the possible changes in the next 3 years. We know the electricity system is changing quickly, for instance, with introduction of renewables, increased digitalization. So we'll try to take those kind of trends into account when we do the risk assessment, as we will only do the unified risk assessment every 3 years. So we need to look ahead a bit. One particular thing to keep in mind is the availability risk. I mean, usually when you do a business impact assessment, you analyze different levels of availability loss of sort of how long the information is not available. We do something similar here. And one of the outcomes is also that we sort of publish in the unified risk assessment report the duration that we analyze. So we report the highest possible impact for all of the duration that were analyzed. And then we also report which duration gives this high impact. So that will be part of the report. At the moment, this is just provided as guidance to the entities and the common authorities for the entity level and member state risk assessment. I mean, entities and member states also need to look at availability risk. We provide this duration as sort of guidance. We think this is the relevant duration. This is the duration you should be considering when you do risk assessment. At the moment, it's not binding to consider risk assessment. So entities or member states can use different durations when they are looking at the loss of availability. And one of the questions is this the right approach? You will see one of the questions in the public consultation will actually be, should we actually require entities or member states to use this duration explicitly? Then Then after the analysis, so applying the impact metrics, we apply the impact, the thresholds. So once we've analyzed the metrics, we can sort of compare them to the thresholds and determine if a process has a higher critical impact, which is relatively straightforward. And then we come to Article 7, which is about the ECAI. So if you look at the impact metrics in the annex, which we'll come to later, but you will see a lot of them are really TSO oriented. So they're easy to calculate for TSOs. We have all the information to sort of a full view of the electricity system, but they may be difficult to calculate for other entities. So if I'm a small producer in the whole system, I may not know what the impact on voltage will be of certain action or on frequency. So we somehow need to translate these sort of TSO system-wide impact metrics into something that entities can calculate. And this sort of describes how that's done and how we get to this ECI, these entity level metrics. So the start is first, we look only at processes that are considered higher critical impact. Then we look for each process, the type of entities that are involved in the process. So not every process will involve all entities, so we only look at the entities that are relevant. Then we look which specific impact metrics are relevant to the entity, so which impact metrics actually give the impacts that lead to a higher critical impact. And then, if needed, we sort of translate the impact metric from the annex into something that's sort of a good approximation, but also the entity itself can calculate with the information they have available to them. And then at the last step, we also, when we convert the metric to the ECI, we also convert the high critical impact metrics for the impact metrics to thresholds for the ECI to be in line with this. So this is sort of how we decide to get to the ECI, which is again one of the outcomes you see here of the union-wide risk assessment. And then finally, we get the union-wide cybersecurity risk assessment report. So this gives the full outcomes of the union-wide risk assessment. So we get sort of the analysis of the compromise of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. We get the entities involved in each higher critical impact process. This should make it easier for competent authorities to determine the high critical impact entities because they know which entities are involved in each process. Then we get the ECI and the high critical impact thresholds for the ECI. And finally, we get the risk impact matrix. So it's something to stress. The risk impact matrix is not currently included in the risk assessment methodology. We are defining fully the risk metrics that will be used in the matrix and also the thresholds, but we have not worked out the likelihood component, and we think it's better to do that after the union-wide risk assessment has been performed, because we then have more insight in how the risk will look like and what the right matrix will be. So the risk impact matrix is not included in this document, but will only be published when the union-wide risk assessment is performed. So that was the union-wide risk assessment. Then we go to the next title, next chapter. That's the regional cybersecurity risk assessment. So there we jump sort of all the way to the end of the process. So normally it's first union-wide, then each entity does their entity-level risk assessment, then we have the member state risk assessment, and in the end we go to the regional cybersecurity risk assessment. The main goal of the regional risk assessment is to aggregate the member state results. So the regional risk assessment is performed by ENTSO-E and DSO entity. ENTSO-E DSO entity gets the member state risk assessment results from all the competent authorities, and they need to aggregate this to come to an overall risk picture for the whole system operations region. So regional mentions the system operations regions that are defined for the European grid. There's a few outcomes of this regional risk assessment. So one is a report just giving the overall risk for the region. Also mitigation plan to mitigate the risk on a region level. And also there will be a set of minimum advanced cybersecurity controls coming out of this. So these will be mandatory controls that each entity will have to apply to comply to the network code. And finally, there will be sort of a comprehensive cybersecurity risk assessment report. This is a full summary of all the risk assessment work that gives an overall view of the state of the cybersecurity risk on the European electricity system. So if we then go back to this, so looking at the objective, you see now that the risk is extended. So we now look at the full risks, the consequences and the likelihood of cyber attacks. And if we look at the steps to be performed, the focus really on the aggregation. So we aggregate results from member state cybersecurity risk assessments. Then we compare the outcomes against the risk thresholds for high critical impact. And then we determine also the threats that lead to high critical impact risk. And this is one of the outcomes will also be a threat list that entities can use. So main thing is the aggregation. So this paragraph describes how we aggregate the risk. So we get the risk assessment results from the member states. So maybe to make it a bit more concrete, I'll go to the Annex 5, which sort of shows how we get the input from the member states. So you see it here. So this is sort of the table that we can expect to get from each member state. So we get 27 of these matrices or these tables filled in. The table consists of a list of processes. So this is coming from the list of unified high critical impact processes. So this was the outcome of the unified risk assessment. And then for each process, there's sort of a risk assessment for the confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And then for each of these factors, the likelihood and impact are determined, which leads to a risk. And this is all done on the risk impact matrix, which is also coming out of the unified risk assessment. So we get sort of consistent outcomes. Every member state uses the same risk matrix, and in this way, the results will be somewhat comparable. For the duration, also there's a request to fill in the duration that was analyzed, because different entities may have different durations when they consider the availability risk. Then the other thing in that entity report is the threats that lead to the risk. So which threats actually cause it to be higher critical impact if a risk is higher critical, and also specific controls to mitigate. As I said, one of the outcomes of the unified risk assessment is to determine the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls. So ENTSO-E, the entity, have to select a set of controls that will be mandatory for all entities within a system operation region. To be able to do that, we need information from the competent authorities and member states. So we ask each competent authority to recommend which measures they think would be useful to mitigate the risks that are higher or critical. And finally, we ask each competent authority also to report the residual risk. So after they've implemented controls in this column, to estimate the residual risk, so what's the likelihood impact and the risk after you've implemented the controls, again, estimated on the risk impact matrix. So this is sort of the information we get, and Sweden get this from 27 member states, and the entities tend to combine this into a risk assessment for the full system operations region. So coming back then again to the regional cybersecurity risk assessment. So this paragraph basically describes how it's done. There are some general rules when we try to aggregate this. So we look at the total risk that the unified process is compromised for any entity system operations region. We will consider cyber attacks that can affect multiple entities. And we assess the risk when the current controls are implemented. So, and the controls that are implemented at the moment that the risk assessment is being performed. Again, we report the outage duration to give insight into what outage was considered. And possibly there's a need to have more information, so ENTSO-E DSNT may request additional information from member states. Then there's two paragraphs 5 and 6 that just stress that ENTSO-E and DSNT are dependent on the information they received from the competent authorities. So it will be very difficult for us to sort of determine if the information delivered by the competent authorities is correct. So we're fully trusting the competent authorities to deliver good and up-to-date information. If no information is provided, then basically it means that we cannot include that in the risk assessment. And finally, there's an article, paragraph 7, which basically links this activity, this regional risk assessment, to the monitoring work that Acer will do. So Acer will monitor the implementation of the monitoring. We've discussed this with Acer, and we both think that using information about risk can be very useful to determine if the network code is effective. And this article basically sort of provides a way that Acer can get the relevant information coming out of the regional risk assessment in time to do their monitoring work. Next is evaluating the risk. So all the risks will be evaluated using the risk impact matrix as is done. And then there's one paragraph specifically about determining the threats. So one of the requirements for the regional risk assessment is to provide a list of threats that should be considered. These threats are then also given to the entities and member states to sort of consider in their own risk assessment, and this is to ensure that all of the relevant threats are actually covered. And there's already a standard list of threats in Annex 3, and basically the regional risk assessment will update this list to be in track with new developments in the threat landscape. And then finally, there's the regional cybersecurity risk assessment report, and all the requirements already are included in Article 23 of the Network Code Regulation, so we don't add a lot of information there, we just refer back to the original network code text. So that's the regional risk assessment. Then we come to Title 4. This is the Member State Cybersecurity Risk Assessment. So again, going back, we're basically going a step back now. We ordered the assessments by the size, but if you look in the timeline, the member states actually before the regional risk assessment. So the previous paragraph is regional risk assessment, now we go to member state risk assessment. Basically, what the member state risk assessment does is you get the results, the Comp 40 in each member state performs that. They get the entity-level risk assessment results from all high and critical impact entities in their member state, and they somehow need to aggregate it into an overall risk view for the entire member states, which they then provide to ENTSO-E and DSO entity for the regional risk assessment. Again, scope is very similar to the regional risk assessment. Again, we consider full risk, so likelihood and consequences. The steps are also very similar. The focus is on aggregating the risk from the members, from the entity levels to get a sort of a member state risk assessment. But there are some additional reporting requirements because the network code also has some requirements to track the, for instance, implementation status. So there's one requirement to also determine the implementation status of minimum advanced cybersecurity controls, so to see if we're actually on track implementing controls. And the other is to summarize information on cyber attacks and cyber threats. So during the information sharing work, that's also part of the network code, the national CSIRTs are actually getting information about reported cyber attacks, reported cyber threats. It would be very good to have an overview of these sort of statistics about these cyber threats, and this will also then be gathered for the member state risk assessment to end up in the comprehensive risk assessment report. And finally, there's a recommendation. So they recommend additional cybersecurity controls. This is to provide input for the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls as mentioned. So, and ENTSO-E as entity in the end need to determine for each region which controls will be mandatory. But as input to that is very important for us to know what competent authorities think are the right controls to mitigate the high and critical risks. One thing to note is if you look at the network code, so we do risk assessment at all level, but mitigation is only done at entity and regional level. So network code sort of requires each entity to do their own risk mitigation as part of the entity level risk management. And there's also a regional risk mitigation plan, which mitigates risk on a regional level. But there's no risk mitigation included on the member state level. So network code does not require member states to do their national mitigation. Of course, and member states can always decide to use the network code information to do this, for instance, also in the NIS2 framework, but it's not required. So it's sort of an option for each member state if they want to use the outcomes of the member state risk assessment for their own risk mitigation, which is described in this article. Then looking at the implementation status, so one thing that ENTSO-E as entity needs to report in a comprehensive report is the status of the implementation of all the cybersecurity measures, all the measures included in network code. To get the relevant input data, we're also asking the member states to report this. We've chosen a relatively simple format for this to limit the work and to get reliable reporting. So we're only asking for the percent of entities that have implemented a certain cybersecurity control and the percent of entities that have derogations for the control. So we've discussed using maturity model, other things, but we thought that would be too complex. And we think this is sort of a way that's relatively objective, easy to implement, and also anonymize the results so that we don't get very detailed information at the regional level. Important thing to note, it's both the implementation of minimum advanced cybersecurity controls that has to be reported, but also all of the other measures. So we've included a list of all the requirements in network, all the measures that have to be implemented, and also for these measures you have to report if they've been implemented or not. And again, in the annexes, there's a template provided to provide this information. Then we get the aggregation of the results. I think it's all very, very similar to the regional risk assessment level. So again, there's some general guidelines. One thing to stress is we have not fixed a specific method to aggregate results. So it can be either for quantitative analysis or expert judgment. We've kept it relatively open. We are analyzing possible methods to do this at the moment, sort of behind the scenes, but they're not included. But this is one of the questions we will also ask you in the public consultation, what methods you think would be best suited to do this aggregation. So which technical methods could be used to implement this step, both at the member state level, but also the regional level. Then other thing included is, so we think member states may miss some of the information. So there are requirements for reporting the entity level results in network code, but competent authorities may not get all the information they need to fill in to do their own risk assessment. So there is a requirement here to also request additional information from entities. So here's a request for competent authorities to gather, for instance, the list of threats that cause a risk, the list of recommended controls. So for each entity, what controls would be recommended to mitigate the risk, and also residual risk. So this would normally not be reported, but we think it's needed to be able to do member state risk assessment. We've provided a template in Annex 4. So it's very similar to the one I showed before. So it's over here with the different processes, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then the risk split in likelihood and impact, the threats, controls, and then the residual risk. The difference is that for the member state, this is only provided as guidance. So competent authorities may use the template, but they're not required to use it. If competent authorities already are getting the information other way, for instance, already from this to their creating risk information, you're still allowed to use the other information. It's just provided there to help the competent authorities. And finally, there are specific requirements also on the critical ICT service providers, sort of to address supply chain risks. So entities will report their critical ICT service providers. What we're asking member states basically to see if we have single points of failure. So if we see a lot of entities using the same supplier being dependent on that, then we've also asked them to analyze that and to report this to be able to determine the possible supply chain threats. Then next part is getting information on cybersecurity, cyber attacks, and cyber threats. As said, the information sharing this information is sent to National CSIRT. The network code sort of sets up a legal collaboration between National CSIRT and competent authority. And what we're asking here is the competent authority actually report this kind of information so that it can be summarized by ENTSO-E and the user entity in a comprehensive risk assessment report. And in Article 18, the controls. So besides assessing the current risk, we also ask the member states, the competent authorities, to provide the controls they would recommend to lower the risk. So if you identify risk as high or critical, then we ask the competent authority also to say what controls would be needed to mitigate this. And this is input to determine the list of the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls at regional level. Again, it can be based on different information. It can be based on implementation status, information on cyber attacks, cyber threats. So all the information that the member state have can be used to determine the control. We do ask to use international standards to do it so that we can get sort of comparable results from different member states. We'll provide a provisional list of standards that could be used as input for this. And we also asked to report residual risk, so the risk after the controls have been implemented. And this is critical for us because we need to determine, and we indeed as an entity need to determine at regional level if the controls are enough. So if the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls have been implemented, is the risk then acceptable? And to do this, we think we need to have the residual risk as input. And then final step for member state risk assessment is to provide a member state risk assessment report. The requirements for that are already included in Article 22 of the network code, so we don't add any additional requirements to that specifically. So these were all the steps. So the union-wide regional member state risk assessments. There are some final provisions. So one is on the timelines. So we are not adding specific timelines here in the methodology because all the timelines are already included in the network code itself. So network code legal text already contains detailed timelines for the regional union-wide member state risk assessment. So we thought it would not be needed to add additional timelines in the methodology. And the other thing is about the language. So the goal is to provide the methodology in English, but yeah, there can be translations, and this is trying to avoid problems with if there's differences in the translation. So this is just a formal legal thing that's also included in other network codes. Okay, so this is the process. What we come now to is the annexes. So the annexes basically gives the technical, detailed technical information. So the first annex gives the impact metrics. So these are the metrics that are used at every level to determine what the possible impact of a cyber attack is on the electricity system. We're mainly basing these metrics on the ENTSO-E incident classification scale. So we decided to use this because this is already widely used by TSOs to think about incidents, so that they're already familiar. There are most of the metrics already mentioned network code, so there's a number of required metrics to be included in network code. So we've covered all of them, and we've taken definitions from the ENTSO-E instance classification scale. There's a number of specific metrics that we've added. One was instance on frequency degradation, the other is validation of voltage standards, and the other one is the other frequency reserve. So frequency, voltage, and the other frequency reserves were not included in the network code legal list, but with the TSO expert, we determined these are very important for the overall status of the electricity system. So we decided to add them to the grid, to the list of metrics. Another thing to highlight is also there's a specific metric on expected duration of outage affecting customers in combination with the scale of the outage in customer minutes. So we call this sort of the formerly customer outage metric. This is included in the network code legal text itself, so it's a required metric. So basically, we're looking at the number of customers affected by an outage times the duration of the outage to sort of see if it affects them. This is specifically included to sort of also cover outage in a smaller area that maybe not involve a lot of load or generation, but that last long and in that way cause a lot of disruption. So we were trying to capture this with this metric here. Then Annex 2 gives the thresholds to determine if something of a risk is higher critical impact. As most of the metrics are coming from the ENTSO-E instance classification scale, we've also included the thresholds from the instance classification scale. So there are thresholds, I think, for scale 2 and 3, which we use as the high critical impact thresholds, so directly taken from the instance classification scale. The only exception is the loss of load and reduction of power generation. There we did not use the ENTSO-E ICS scales, but we used the ECI. Specifically, we based them on the provisional ECI because we want to be aligned with the ECI and the thresholds here to make sure that we don't get any inconsistencies there. We have thresholds at union-wide, regional, and union-wide, regional, and member state level. What made it difficult is that the ENTSO-E ICS thresholds are done on a synchronous area basis. So there are thresholds for each synchronous area. So we needed to translate that. So for member states, it was relatively straightforward. So we take for each member state the relevant thresholds from the ICS for the synchronous area that they're in. So we can just, like each member state's in one synchronous area, we then take the threshold compared to that, except for the reduction of the load and generation metrics where we use the provisional ECI. So this table here you see for the load and generation are taken from the ECI, but for the rest it's taken directly from the ICS. Difficulty comes then for the region level because the region level is done on a system operations region and the system operations regions don't directly match to the synchronous area. So most system operations regions are contained in one synchronous area. So for Southeastern Europe, Southwestern Europe, Nordic and Baltic, we just took the synchronous area that they're part of. So Baltic synchronous area, Nordic synchronous area, and for these the Continental Europe synchronous area. The challenge was Central Europe because Central Europe, I mean, it's mostly countries in Continental Europe, but it also includes Ireland as part of the Central Europe System Operations region, which is in a different synchronous area. In this case, we did decide to take the Continental Europe thresholds for the Central Europe System Operations region because, well, most countries are included in this System Operations region, and we think it's also more reflective of the overall risk than taking the Irish thresholds. It does mean that for Ireland specifically, the high critical impact threshold may be a bit high, but we think this is a good trade-off for having good metrics for the other parts of the Central Europe System Operations region. And finally, we need to have the union-wide threshold. So for the whole union, there we decided to go with the Continental Europe thresholds. First, because it's the largest synchronous area within the EU, so it has the most impact. And second, also because all the other areas are connected to this, so it's sort of central in the whole European grid. And we think it's the best representative of the relevant thresholds. So this is how we derive the thresholds, mainly from the ENTSO-E ICS, some from the ECI, and then aggregating upwards from the member state level. Then finally, we have a list of cyber threats. So there's a list of threats that need to be considered in each risk assessment, and this is input for the threats. So most of them, the first 5 are actually supply chain threats. These are explicitly taken from network code itself. They were included in the framework guidelines, and they're sort of directly included. So that's the severe and unexpected corruption of supply chain until the introduction of backdoors. Then there were 5 additional threats added. You can see here, so all the way from attacks through communication networks to insider threats. We've based them, and we looked at different threat models. We've mainly based this on the list that's in ISO 27005-2011 version. There's a list of threats there. We took there the intentional threats, and we somewhat grouped them because we wanted to give relatively a high-level threat list to start with, at least, because we know different entities have different threat descriptions, and we didn't want to fix on a very precise threat list, so we sort of kept it relatively high-level and aggregated, but we think we are covering all of the relevant threats to the electricity system with the list that we have here. And then at the end, we have the annexes for the entity-level risk assessment report. So this is, as we discussed, so this is what the entities or what member states, the Common Authority member states can use to request information from entities. Again, the use of this is voluntary, so Common Authorities can also collect in a different way, but we thought it's easy for Common Authorities to have some guidance on what they should be asking from entities. And there's a similar format here for member states. So this is required to be used, so each Common Authority has to use this specific template to report the outcomes of the member state risk assessment to ENTSO-E and the user entity, so we can use it for the regional risk assessment. And finally, this also includes a report for the states sort of reporting the status of the controls. So I said member states are requested to report if certain controls have been implemented, both the minimum controls, the advanced controls, and also specific measures, including network code, where we ask specifically for the percent of entities that have implemented the control and the percentage of derogations that are included. So this is also to streamline this reporting process. So I think this is the full methodology. So at this point, I will hand over back to Daiga for the Q&A and the next steps.
Thank you very much. I'll just wait a minute until the slides are up. Right. Thank you. Indeed, if we can go to the next steps. So the next steps, one of the ones that you're probably interested is, as you know, we're recording the workshop. Will this be available? Yes, it will be. It will be available on ENTSO-E website after the workshop, together with the presentation. So both of those things will be uploaded online. So in case if your colleagues could not attend, please feel free to share it, as this is a public information. Please also pencil down in your agendas the second workshop, which will take place on the 2nd December between 9 and 10:30 CET time. The goal of this workshop will be to already assess what sort of comments we have received. Maybe you will already have a chance to introduce yourself better with the methodologies, and hence you might have a bit more advanced also questions. So we will be happy to answer that during this period. So please pencil it down and dial in again. Also, please note that the public consultation will close on 5th December. The link is available on this presentation that will be uploaded on the website, but of course it's also available if you search ENTSO-E website. You'll see there available public consultations. You'll see the link and the form where you can fill in your feedback. So please do not miss to provide that. And after this public consultation, feedback will be received by our experts. We will need some time, of course, to digest them. So you can expect around January to receive a feedback to your comments, how they've been incorporated, what have been done with them, and so forth. So there will be some sort of a document available again publicly for you to see how we have treated your comments. And following this, the document will undergo internal ENTSO-E and DSO entity finalization process and all TSO approval, as explained at the beginning of the workshop. And the legal deadline for this deliverable or risk assessment methodologies is 13th of March 2025. If we go to the next slide. Here you can see also the link once you see the presentation. But in any case, if you just Google ENTSO-E, you'll find very quickly our website. There you find all the latest information about the network code and the deliverables that we're working on. As well, I would invite you to check YouTube channel of ENTSO-E. There you will find a series of videos that were prepared together with DSO entity on various topics on the network code, and some of them really touch upon this risk assessment methodologies arena. So have a look if you would like to learn some additional information on this topic. And of course, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact ENTSO-E and DSO entity via the email addresses that you see on the screen. Or of course, you can reach out to me or any experts from TSOs and DSOs working on the topic directly. We definitely coordinate that regularly, so we will manage to answer to any requests you may have.